So good morning, everybody. Thank you all very much for being here, for giving us your time on this Thursday morning. This is the second of 6 Dare UK workshops and stakeholder engagements that we're running. This workshop and the focus for today will be on funding and incentives. And we're really sort of looking to have a conversation with you and get some feedback about our early thinking around the draft recommendations that we're sort of developing here as part of the Dare UK program. Before we get into it, I think just to make sure everyone has a good grounding in the program and what we're about, I'm going to hand over to Hans-Erik Aronson, who is the director of the DARE program, just to give us sort of an overview of the program and what we're trying to do here. So Hans-Erik, over to you.
I can share my screen here. Hopefully that will work. I assume that you can see my screen.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So I'm Hans-Erik Aronson. I'm the director of DARE UK Phase 1. DARE UK is the Data Analytics Research Environments UK. And so what we're about, it's a pan-UKRI initiative. UKRI is the biggest public funder of research in the UK. The aim of the program is to enable a step change in the UKRI or national research capability for secure sharing, linkage, and analysis of sensitive data for research and innovation, both at pace and at scale. So you can see these hexagons here are all the components of UKRI, and they're all part of, we're basically spanning all of those components in our journey. So it's a multi-phase program. We have phases 1, 2, and 3. We are heading up phase 1. So phase 1 is a design and dialogue phase. It's an extensive program of community engagement with researchers, technologists, and the public that should culminate in a co-designed blueprint for the next generation of trusted research environments with standards, access, and accreditation, ethics policies based on trustworthiness, security, and interoperability. You will hear a lot about trustworthiness. That's a very important part of what we're doing, that we remain trustworthy with the public. It's instead, we're talking about basically public data sets across domains and of a sensitive nature. So the question that we're trying to answer here is basically how should national secure and interoperable digital research infrastructure and associated services be designed and implemented? Again, this is over a number of years. This infrastructure is to connect and analyze complex, sensitive, and often unconsented data from across disciplines and sectors in a flexible, efficient, and sustainable way. Health Data Research UK, HDR UK, and Administrative Data Research UK, ADR UK, were jointly commissioned by UKRI to undertake phase 1 of the program. The delivery team that you're meeting today is based at HDR UK, but the program is indeed a joint effort of both HDR and ADR. So we are managed by both. And so there are a number of assumptions that were made when we started this. We're not starting from scratch. There's a cross-council need. Federated infrastructure is technically feasible. It is ethically and legally feasible and would be trusted by the public. And we can achieve this within the funding and time envelope that is set. And that there is strong buy-in across research councils. So these are our core components that inform the the program to start with, that it would fund it at all. We started this by conducting a landscape review. This is supported by Kernal Farrar and consultancy. And in the landscape review, this is taking place in the fall of last year, we identified 6 areas of concern or that we needed to focus on in this: data and discovery, access and accreditation, digital research infrastructure, capability and capacity, demonstrating trustworthiness with the public, and funding and incentives. And today, the workshop we're hosting today is about the last portion of this, funding and incentives. This is, of course, as mentioned, workshop 2. So we have 4 more to go after this. So the process and deliverables are outlined here in this diagram here. The teal colored hexagons are the 6 areas that I just mentioned. The key deliverables is the blueprint that I mentioned earlier and a business case. And we are also called upon to provide a detailed delivery plan for phase 2 and an outlined delivery plan for phase 3. The process for how to do this is public and stakeholder engagement in phase 1, as well as a series of sprint exemplar projects that are that we have funded, or UKRI has really funded, that are taking place right now across the UK. They are looking at key components of this federated analysis landscape that we are proposing to see how feasible it is. I should mention there's a stag in the middle of this. We have a scientific and technology advisory group that is advising us as well as advising the program board that we report into. So again, we have a number of phases here, and overarching to this is the public, the needs of the public, the researchers and data custodians, and the trusted research environment community. This is the delivery team that are working to deliver phase 1. So I'm the director. You have the rest of the team on the call as well. Jerry Riley, Michelle, Lizzie, and Fergus are on the call. Sushil is not joining us today, our technical lead, and Lucy Gould, our finance partner, is also not joining us today. Here are links to our main website, as well as to a landscape review that was conducted in the fall. There is additional information on the sprints on our website as well. And I should just mention briefly, the concept of a TRE, a trusted research environment, is basically a safe computing environment that is governed by 5 principles that we hear a lot about: 5 safes: safe people, projects, settings, data, and outputs. So this is to say that the people that are allowed to view the data and do this analysis are sort of vetted to be considered safe. The projects are reasonable and are intended to, they're not inappropriately accessing data for just spurious reasons, but for true research that will benefit the public. The settings are safe. Data is not easily hackable. The data should be secure. The data has been de-identified so that individual data is not viewable, or at least if it's viewable, it would not be under severe or very stringent safeguards, and by very few. And in the end, the outputs from the analysis is deemed safe for export. So there are export controls before you can move the data outside for publication or for presentation to stakeholders, say, to inform government policy. Either way, the data that leaves the environment is controlled. So thank you. I'm going to stop sharing there and hand back to Fergus.
Great. Thanks, Hans-Erik. So what we're going to do now is we're basically going to sort of jump into the funding and incentives chapter and more or less walk you through some of the draft recommendations that we have, some of the early thinking that we've got. So I'm going to share my screen and I'll take us through this. Can someone just give me an indication if that's working?
Yep.
Fantastic. All right. So we're going to talk about funding and incentives in this workshop today. Again, just to reiterate, this is really just sort of our sort of early thinking and directions of travel. So these is really all draft, and we're looking sort of for feedback, input from you to sort of let us know if you see gaps and how you think that's going, and we'll get into that. So just a reminder, I suppose Hans-Erik's already pretty much covered this, but this is sort of the, I suppose, more lay mission statement for the DARE UK program, and it's really to design and deliver a national data research infrastructure, very much specifically focused on sensitive data, that is joined up, demonstrates trustworthiness, and supports research at scale for public good. in terms of these recommendations, sort of what's gone into them, right? So what is the basis for some of the recommendations which we're drafting? This comes very much out of the landscape review, which we conducted, and of course, a lot of other conversations that we've had across the landscape with stakeholders. So that's sort of what's feeding into the recommendations, which we're going to walk through now. So in terms of funding and incentives, I think it's worth giving just a bit of context around sort of the key, I guess, challenges that that have come up in a lot of the discussions, and what have sort of steered the direction of the recommendations that that we're going to show you in a moment. So the first is, sensitive data digital research infrastructure, which I hope for everybody it's okay if I refer to that as DRI going forward, because it can be a bit of a mouthful. But maybe just to define what we mean by DRI, or digital research infrastructure, for the DARE-UK program, and from our perspective, this basically encompasses the hardware elements, so basically the nuts and bolts that enable analytics, the software layer, so basically the applications that are running on the nuts and bolts, and the people, sort of the resources that need to manage all of that and make it happen. So when we say DRI, it's sort of all encompassing. And the last thing I should add there is the governance layer that sits on top of that as well. So it's quite a broad statement, but just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing there. So sensitive DRI, sensitive data DRI today is generally funded through sort of the traditional investigator-based grant model. And this is obviously then supplemented with capital grants, but they tend to be, I would say, somewhat sporadic, at least from what we've been able to gather. And what this means is that you end up having a lot of sort of what is often referred to as sort of a top slicing approach, or baking in, let's say, infrastructure costs to research grants. So they're baked into the budget for research grants. The other challenge is that a lot of the time these sort of investigator-led research grants are time limited. So it might be a one-year grant, and that doesn't really fit with the requirements for funding and planning the funding for DRI. It needs longer time horizons. It's very often domain specific. So it's sort of not really joined up. It very much sits in certain domains where those funding allocations come from, and it doesn't always incentivize for that reason the reuse of DRI. And then lastly, the business continuity and disaster recovery requirements, especially if we think about nationally critical systems in DRI. This is an area as well where you need to have sort of strategic funding to support this. So the second point then, federated ecosystem, and maybe we should start with federation. The definition of federation is pretty broad. There's a lot of different components to it. I suppose for the purposes of the discussion here, we'll try to keep it more or less. Federation is, at least from an analytics perspective, is the ability to analyze different data sets that are held in different environments, and bringing then the results of those different analysis in different environments together to deliver an overall research output. That's very much federated analytics. Tried to capture it as simply as I can without being necessarily the expert. There's a lot of other components like federated infrastructure compute, federated identity management. I would say for these, we're not going to get too deep into it here. It's very much for a workshop we have coming up that Jerry will be leading on the 24th of March. So if you want to get into that, please feel free to join there. So to the second point, a federated ecosystem doesn't exist yet, and it needs to be established, and it needs to be done in a way that's coordinated. Oh, sorry, I've skipped slides there. It needs to be done in a way that's coordinated. And we sort of need to determine, what is the initial funding required to establish that? Not only the initial, but the long-term funding that's required to sort of establish a federated ecosystem. And it, of course, needs to be sustainable, both from a funding perspective, but also how you recover costs throughout that federated ecosystem. The third point is then access to large-scale compute for sensitive data research. This is something which came up, especially in the landscape review, but we've had it in other discussions as well, is sort of this requirement for large-scale compute, and how do you do that in a way that is sort of cost effective? So we need to sort of figure out or investigate what kind of use cases there are for this, and sort of what is the financing needed to make large-scale compute accessible for sensitive data research. Then we've got business continuity, high availability, disaster recovery, which I sort of touched on as well. And this is, again, very much a critical component if you're looking at DRI as a national asset and a critical asset. So how do you fund that strategically? How does Federation potentially support that as well? And then finally, sort of a little bit of a bucket at the end is incentives, service levels, and research culture. So this is, you know, defining and documenting the spectrum of, I guess, what you would call operating models and the incentives in those operating models for federated services in a federated ecosystem. Defining minimum service levels for sensitive data DRI, and then appropriate recognition of the role of DRI in research output. So how do you recognize the contribution that it makes? So that's sort of context. We haven't got into the recommendations yet. I need to check myself for time quickly. But let's jump right into the first recommendation. So the first recommendation is, or draft recommendation, I should say, is to develop a purpose-built grant for addressing the costs for the maintenance of cross-domain national sensitive data DRI. So this is really, you know, tailored to address the operational funding requirements of this DRI. And the federation, the core federation services that are a component of that. It needs to address, you know, appropriately the time horizons that are sort of inherent in DRI, and making sure that we can do stable, predictable planning for this. It needs to address both the capital and the operational expenses. So, you know, these are slightly different things. Well, not slightly different things, but there's a bit of nuance in that, but it needs to address both. It also needs to sort of look at the minimum service levels for providers. You know, so if we have, let's say, these DRI providers who are more or less providing a service to the research community and being funded to do so, what are sort of the minimum levels of service that are required from the community to these DRIs, to these providers of DRI? And then sort of the last point is, obviously, it will also get us, or sort of enable, a bit more transparency on what are the operational costs for national sensitive data DRI, and allow for sort of better funding projections, better funding planning around all of this. So that's the first recommendation, purpose-built grant. Moving into the second, and these are, you know, recommendation 2 and 3 are a bit more around sort of the core federation services. So recommendation 2 is determining the funding requirements to establish the first phase of a sort of federated DRI ecosystem for sensitive data. This will be very much based on a lot of the discussion that will come out of the core federation services theme, which I mentioned earlier on the 24th of March. But basically, it's, you know, we need to determine what initial investments we need to make to establish the first stage of this. We need to also investigate whether there's, you know, core, or let's say standard federation services that are consistently required across the ecosystem, and what's the best way to resource that and fund it. The third recommendation is then talking to, I suppose, what we sort of term the operating model for a federated ecosystem. You know, what do these operating model, or models, as there may be more than one, look like? We need to map these out. We need to determine sort of whether, you know, based on these operating models, how does the cost recovery look across that federated network of DRIs? This is quite a complex question. And if they sort of differ, you know, if there are differences across different sectors. And then we certainly need to determine if it's feasible based on the operating models. You know, are there scenarios where it's just not technically feasible to do cost recovery? And if that's the case, what other approaches could there be to manage the costs for federated DRI? So that's recommendation 2 and 3. very much focused on the federation component. The fourth recommendation then is the cost implications for appropriate business continuity and disaster recovery requirements, especially if we're going to consider these as national assets. A national federated DRI ecosystem would be considered a national asset, and you need to protect that appropriately. So it's strategically important to ensure that there's fail-safes in place. We need to investigate whether federation can serve to mitigate some of the costs, to distribute, distribute some of those costs for high availability and disaster recovery. And we also need to sort of pilot that. So we need to do some pilot scenarios, and in a first phase, determine the funding needed to do those pilots between different DRI sites. The fifth recommendation then is talking about the integration of large-scale compute in a federated sensitive data DRI ecosystem. So it's really, what are the use cases for that? You need to investigate that. We need to define those use cases. We need to then investigate and develop a cost model to identify when should we be approaching it in which way. So it's really identifying, we know that there's commercial cloud providers who obviously can provide access to large scale compute, but that does become cost prohibitive at a point. So when does it make sense to go with a commercial cloud provider versus provisioning it through the existing and publicly funded national large scale compute capabilities we have within the UK? And then sort of the last point there is validating the feasibility and initial investment needed to do the actual integration piece of making large scale compute available in a federated ecosystem of sensitive data DRI. All right. In the final two, almost done. The final two are sort of very much about, I suppose, incentives around the sharing of data. So recommendation 6 is really about raising awareness amongst data owners regarding the legal framework around the secondary use of data for research. And this is really the Digital Economy Act. There's a lot of work that's been done here, very good work by Administrative Data UK, Administrative Data Research UK, so ADR UK, along with the UK Statistics Authority. So there's been a lot of sort of work done there already to bridge this understanding within government, making sort of administrative data sets available. But there are still different interpretations of the legal basis, and that then does create some wariness, understandably, amongst data owners. And we need to clarify that, and we need to really align the understanding and the interpretation of legal basis. And there needs to be resourcing for this. There sort of needs to be this joined up resource or advice that should be developed to outline the legal basis for data sharing and linkage. And then the final recommendation for today is recommendation 7. And this is dedicating greater resources to incentivizing data owners to routinely, and I think the key word is routinely, share and link data for research. And this is really about supporting the development of sort of sustainable research-ready data resources from across sectors. And certainly a big piece of awareness raising regarding the security processes that are in place, the 5 safes that Hans-Erik has already sort of mentioned in the TRE piece, evidencing public support for data research and the good that it can do, and the policy benefits associated with data sharing and linkage. Those were the 7 sort of recommendations for now that we're going to shortly discuss. There are a couple of other elements to the funding and incentives theme that we won't touch on today just because of time, but also because we're still working through this. I thought I'd just mention them briefly. So this is the formal recognition of the contribution that DRI, digital research infrastructure, makes in research outputs. How do we do that? How do we sort of ensure that that incentive is in place? Balancing innovation and collaboration within the research culture through intelligent incentives. So how do we incentivize innovation, but at the same time don't veer too much into the space where we're not going to be collaborating effectively? The third point is then leveraging international opportunities for funding. And the fourth is, how do we integrate industry within a federated ecosystem? How do they fit within the operating model? Great. I think I'm more or less on time. We do have sort of maybe 5+3, I think, minutes for clarifications before we move into our breakout rooms. So if there are any questions generally around what I've just presented, any clarifications that you want to ask, please feel free to just raise a hand or pop yourself into the chat and ask your question. And we'll take 5 minutes for that.
There's a few in the chat already to be dived on.
All right, I'll stop sharing my screen. Let me have a look at the chat quickly. Okay, another issue with sporadic funding is from Mark Wilkinson, another issue with sporadic funding is the difficulty and need for funding people to support this. Yeah, I mean, we totally agree, Mark. So that's very much, when I mentioned earlier what we mean by the scope of the term digital research infrastructure or DRI, it's not just talking about sort of the nuts and bolts or the software layer. It's really talking about how do you fund the people, because fundamentally you need people to run these systems, to run those nuts and bolts, and that's very much part of our definition of DRI. So totally agree, and that needs to be addressed in the grant as well. From Catherine O'Sullivan, when you say national, do you mean the whole of the UK? Yeah. So I'll answer that one before I move to the next. Yes. I've seen recent approaches that define national as England plus Wales and leaves out Northern Ireland and Scotland from national funding. This is absolutely not what we mean. So when we say national, we mean all 4 nations without question. Ada Sanchez, what's the difference between a DRI and a TRE? So Jerry can maybe jump in here, but if I were to sort of try to make it as simple as I can, DRI, I would say, is the broader term for infrastructure. I would say the TRE, or a trusted research environment, which is a secure computing environment, is a component of DRI. So it's a part of the DRI, but it's a smaller piece, a specific piece of DRI. I'm not sure if, Jerry, you want to elaborate on that. But
yeah. What I would see, and it perhaps answers one of the other questions that's in there as well, is a trusted research environment is a discrete environment that might be run by an organization, maybe one of the major data custodians, that provides a secure environment for analysis. So an environment that meets the characteristics of the ONS 5 safe. So it's a discrete environment such as the Secure Research Services or EPCC or SAIL. So it's a discrete environment. By DRI, we mean the overall, it's effectively the overall vision of what a integrated research infrastructure that federated the TREs together to provide us a secure federated capability for research on sensitive data. And our real focus for the DARE UK program is on how we build that federation, not on how we build out a new set of TREs. TREs are developing. We have views on how they should develop. We're not looking to build TRE capability directly. What we're looking at is ensuring the TREs that exist and are emerging can be federated to provide a secure environment across the 4 nations of the UK for analysis on sensitive data.
Great, thanks, Jerry. I think that probably also then answers Lisa's question. To Richard Ostler, I apologize if I'm saying that incorrectly. Research-ready data means resourcing good data management, but this is often neglected. It's easy to share unusable data. So how do you incentivize to prevent this? Good question and a good point, Richard. I would say let's discuss it in the breakout room. I'd be curious to hear if you have ideas about how to incentivize that. So from Paul Richards around incentives, who are the data owners you think you will need to target? Will it span researchers to large organizations? Presumably incentives and engagement needs might be quite diverse. They will be very diverse, definitely. And I think that probably there's more work needed in certain areas than others. I think there's a lot of work already being done on this, and successful work that's been done. It's quite a big question, Paul. I would say let's get into it in the breakout rooms, if that's fine, just in the interest of time. Trying to go through quickly. Richard was. Right. So Richard, I think also I would put that into the Jamboards. So you'll know what the Jamboard is when you get into the breakout room, but let's plug that in there. I think bring in sort of the SRC secondary data analysis initiative there. From Shad Chokda, the public are becoming more aware of the value of their data. What will you do to ensure greater trust can be built between large data infrastructure and the public? So Shad, we do actually, I mean, there's a lot of public engagement work that not only us as the DARE UK program have done, but you know, other programs throughout the research ecosystem. We also have, we had on Tuesday a sort of workshop specifically talking about this. So it's exactly the right question. I would say we're probably not going to get too deep into it in this workshop just because we're focused on funding and incentives. But by all means, we can have a separate discussion if you like on that one, or reach out to the team through the website and our email.
Yeah. And just to add that if you did miss the demonstrating trustworthiness workshop, or if you can't make any of the others, we will make sure to capture the discussions on the website, so that's incoming.
So just going through, James Robson, is there a proposal for a privacy professional team to be costed in alignment with recommendation 6? A blanket lawful basis may not be the best approach. Again, James, I would say interesting idea that we probably need to like dive into a little deeper. So let's keep it for the breakout room, but definitely I'd be curious what you mean with a privacy professional team, but let's bring it into the breakout rooms, I would say, and have the discussion there where we've got a bit more time. Okay, I think I've captured all of them in the chat. If there are no other questions now, then what we're going to do is pop into the breakout rooms. I think Michelle's going to pop us into the breakout rooms, and then let's carry on the discussion a bit more deeply there. Great. So we're going to go sort of into more or less the bigger round now. Thank you all very much for your time, and for those of you who are still with us, much appreciated, and for all the input. So we're going to now go into basically each of the facilitators will sort of try to capture the main points that were discussed in their room, and we'll sort of go through this in more or less for 15 to 20 minutes. Hopefully we can do it a bit quicker, and then we can just leave some time for clarifications, questions, and a bit of a bigger discussion in the round before we close out. So maybe, seeing as I anyway have the microphone, I can start here and try to capture at least what I thought were some of the key points from our discussion, and please feel free if I miss any to jump in if you like. So what I thought was sort of quite relevant on the first recommendation regarding this new type of grant was there did seem to be pretty much big support for it, and that it's really needed, and that's sort of good to hear. A lot of the challenges which we see here around, you know, appropriate timeframes for funding and providing stability to, you know, to planning, this was all very much supported. There's an interesting point around sort of 80% versus 100% FEC for sort of the facilities, I suppose, for the DRI facilities. And this is an interesting, maybe a bit of a detail, but I thought an interesting point that needs to be looked into. Just looking at the notes here. I think what came through quite strongly, I mean, there's a couple of comments, but it's sort of this new type of grant really needs to be developed intelligently, right? With a lot of detail. You need to really map it out properly. You make sure the terms and conditions are all very tight and very clear, and also that, you know, the funding is appropriate for what you're asking to be delivered. So that was sort of what came through very strongly on the first recommendation. Around the sort of recommendation 2 and 3, the federation elements, sort of, especially on the minimum service levels, I thought that was quite an interesting sort of discussional point. Was minimum service levels are fine and acceptable so long as the funding meets those expectations or meets what you're sort of asking for in terms of minimum service delivery. So you've got to, you've really got to balance those out and not expect that, not make them unrealistic with the funding that you're going to allocate for that. The balance between sort of centralizing some of the federation elements versus keeping it sort of federated, if that's maybe the right word, or let's say decentralized. There's got to be a right balance, and it's got to be an appropriate balance. It's not one or the other for sure. Just looking at time, let me move on reasonably quickly. The fourth recommendation on sort of business continuity disaster recovery, very much that public cloud could play a role here, but there's really a risk of lock-in, and that was something which I thought was interesting as well. Sort of how do you balance appropriately between public cloud for providing that security, I suppose, that fail-safe over sort of national infrastructure that is not public cloud. I think, so I'm just trying to skim through here. On our fifth recommendation on large-scale compute, I think the main message here was make sure that you sort of define the requirements properly here, and that you really sort of map out what the use cases are, what the requirement is, before diving into anything there. There was another point here that make sure you ask the right questions of the right people, I guess. The researchers don't always know what they need technically, they just know what they want to do. And you need to make sure that you facilitate the discussion between sort of the researchers and then bridging that through to the technical requirements and those who can intelligently say what is needed to meet those requirements. And then finally, on the last two recommendations, 6 and 7, it was sort of the point about the challenges around the DEA framework, and that doesn't cover certain aspects of health data, for example, and that needed to really be worked on. Sort of the idea of sharing best practices as an incentive and incentivizing the reuse of those practices. This was something that came through as well. And I think I'll probably leave it at that, because it's probably a little bit over time. So those were great discussion. I really enjoyed it. So maybe I will pass the ball. Jerry, you look to be unmuted, so I'll pick on you, and maybe you can take us through what you guys discussed.
Okay, so again, really excellent and engaging discussion, and we didn't get through all of the recommendations and screens because we went deep rather than broad. So poor facilitating by me, I know. So we did highlight that the current funding model not only is it difficult to sustain, but it also causes fragmentation and duplication of effort, because people are being very tactical in setting up environments that suit their needs rather than thinking broader. So there was a discussion around fragmentation and duplication. One of the important points coming through, looking at both the question of how to fund infrastructure for the future, but also how to do cost recovery, was around ensuring that we still have capability that is free at the point of research, because there needs to be capability to allow people to develop their thoughts and ideas before they go into the research proposals. And therefore, as we look at the cost recovery models, it needs to make sure that we don't break the world of being able to explore your research, have a funded infrastructure that is capable of doing that before you actually have grant capability available to you. And also that we are looking at a model that doesn't make it easier to go off and do your own thing. So any model around cost recovery needs to not discourage use of the infrastructure. So it needs to be simple, it needs to be clear, it needs to be transparent, so that it's not easier for me to go and spend $250,000 from my research grant in standing up compute in AWS, because that's just easier to do than use the infrastructure that's around the federated DRI that we have. So we need to make sure that any model works well. We did spend quite a long time, and that's probably a little bit of a steer from me, looking at the disaster recovery and business continuity questions. We had quite a lot of discussion around spreading risk, over centralization of capability. Whilst it's attractive at some levels, federation should help us away from that over centralization, and over centralization carries a risk that if we lose an infrastructure, the impact is very significant. There was consensus that we need to be looking at this in more depth. We need to be looking at how public cloud and a hybrid approach could improve our resilience. We need to be looking at how we can look between institutions and say, right, okay, how would we provide a business continuity perhaps by partnering up with somebody, so that we have an approach between institutions, between different infrastructures. And also we need to do the risk analysis, perhaps at a national level, not at an institute level, of what is needed and where to support a coherent approach to disaster recovery. So what are the risks of losing a major infrastructure, EPCC? What would be the impact? What would be our recovery strategy from that situation? Because I think there is a feel that we're not looking at that from a national research strategy point of view. Maybe it is, but the risks of the likelihood may be very, very low, but the risks to UK research would be catastrophic.
All right, thanks, Jerry. I will then, who shall I pick on next? Lizzie.
Yeah, so lots of really good discussion in our group as well. So I won't necessarily run through the recommendations one by one, but I'll just pick up some of the key points. So one thing that came up was really the need to consolidate spending to make sure that there's not lots of different development going on in different pockets. So I guess really in this vein of kind of making sure things are joined up, making sure that the funding is joined up in a way that it's collaborative and development is supportive of what else is going on in the sector, rather than kind of shooting out funding into different areas. Also making sure that we're working with industry to really make the most of the developments that they've already made, not starting from scratch. Making sure that those what the work that's already been done is really being harnessed and kind of worked on collaboratively as well. And also making sure that in terms of longer term funding, making sure that what's already working well has that ongoing funding, that we're not focusing everything in new development, that things that are working well also get the funding that they need to continue to do that. There was also, we also talked about how trusted research environments are a culture change for researchers. It's still quite new, so there are a few needs there, particularly in terms of software that's needed for analysis of large data sets. What kind of software is missing? Where does funding need to focus there? And also funding for researchers to actually make sure they're able to access these systems, to make sure that they're not inaccessible to researchers who perhaps have smaller funding pots. So making sure that that support is there. In terms of cost recovery, there's a sense that there is already a lot of resource going into this TREs have their own, disaster recovery. TREs tend to have their own disaster recovery as an essential part of their setup. So there was a thought around centralizing this to make it easier for TREs to focus on the more everyday ongoing processes, and then having some sort of central support or resourcing for disaster recovery to make that easier. In terms of large-scale compute, we spoke quite a bit about genetic data as a good use case. It's on the basis that it's quite complicated when it comes to both storing and sharing this type of data, especially when maintaining the privacy of the individuals that data relates to. So that was seen as potentially a good use case. And we also spoke quite a bit about the challenges of data linkage across different types of data, so health and other non-health administrative data, and how work needs to really go into sorting out the legal basis for this. And there was the idea of perhaps having a central privacy and legal team that is really there to help do this, to help support this type of data linkage, and that it was seen that there's still a lot of barriers against this type of data linkage. So in terms of the legal basis that need to be sorted out. And yeah, I think overall, there was just a clear feeling for more centralized resourcing to support a lot of what's going on, so that the smaller organizations or the more focused, basically, so that researchers and TREs can focus more on their kind of day-to-day processes, and the centralization of support on things like the legal side, the disaster recovery, and that sort of those kind of additional bits. And also a general feeling for resources to support this kind of culture shift. Really, it's all still quite new. So resources in terms of information and standardization as well, in terms of privacy and security and so on. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Lizzie. Hans-Erik?
Easier when I'm not on mute. So we've covered a lot of ground already, and we're running up a little bit on the clock here, so I'm going to be fairly brief. We had a pretty far and wide-ranging discussion, and we had participation from both the patient side, the clinical side, as well as from Research Data Scotland, and from the agricultural sector, which is new to us, which is useful and different in kind in terms of the challenges they face. One thing that came up on the patient side was the challenge of building an infrastructure that collects and manages data at an academic level of finesse, shall we say, or with their safeguards and rigor that is required in academia, that sometimes needs to be shared out to the commercial sector, where they really don't need the same kind of rigor. So how do you then charge them an appropriate amount when they're not really requiring the same kind of elaborate infrastructure? So they could perhaps, they would expect a lower fee than they are charged. I'm paraphrasing a little bit there. So that's a new one, but basically doing chargebacks across domains can be challenging sometimes when you deal with, certainly from the academic to the commercial sector. On the agricultural side, they struggled with getting summary data because they dealt with commercially sensitive data from farms, and they couldn't get the detailed data unless they built it from scratch with the individual farms. Whereas summary data wouldn't give the detailed data that they would need from to do academic research. So these are cross-domain type things that we haven't come across before, but they're informative in terms of how we incentivize a landscape that is unusual perhaps from what we typically encounter in our discussions with people. We covered the same issues that you talked about here before, but disaster recovery, business continuity, as well as ongoing funding beyond the 5-year typical refresh cycle for equipment, and how to do, say, distributed disaster recovery, business continuity across institutions. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Michelle, who is the last breakout room.
Okay. It's difficult. We haven't got much time left because we want to take contributions. So just a lot of what has been said already was iterated in my group too. We had a fantastic discussion. I think I'll just maybe make one additional comment that I don't think it's been touched on, just the idea that actually from discussions, policy helps. And one of the key things is just make sure that policy is enforced. So almost the stick rather than the carrot, but whatever policies are in place, how the things are centralized, having the mechanism to ensure that those kind of policies are enforced is something that was highlighted as being important. Otherwise, similar comments with regards to things like full economic costs being covered, a bit about personalization. So for example, minimum service level that should be differentiated according to the service or the data that is being provided. But yeah, I'll stop there, just a whistle-stop stop kind of summary.
Thanks, Michelle. So I know we've only got 5 minutes left, but and we can stay a little bit longer if people are willing. But I'd sort of open the floor. Are there any comments anyone wants to make? Any observations? Please feel free. Any questions?
Before I misrepresented some of the things that were said in our session, didn't cover them. So please feel free to chime in. And we have an active Jamboard as well to draw on later.
So I just make one quick comment. I think it's this initiative is great, and the fact that you're talking to so many people through these workshops is fantastic. So thank you for doing that. The only thing I'd say is the faster we can get to the point of implementing some of those recommendations, such as the one around scoping and pilots, I think it's important that the DRI gets going for UKRI as soon as possible. And everyone knows this, and I know every year, I'm sure you're working flat out to do that. But just to say, yeah, the faster we can move this forward, the better, I would say, as long as it's done well. And it looks like you're doing a great job in terms of at least talking to everyone, which is really important.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, we're well aware of the pressure to get the ball moving. We're feeling it.
Yeah.
Are there? Sorry, I just seen the chat here. So from Caroline, one key aspect in funding was linked to the previous workshop on trustworthiness. So that happened on Tuesday, and building some sort of accreditation on pillars of trustworthiness into funding incentives. Not sure if I understand, Caroline, or if you want to elaborate, if you're comfortable to.
Yeah, it came up in a couple of aspects of our discussion, both in the clinical setting, but also in, and obviously that revolves around sensitive patient data, but also in the commercial sector with agriculture, and that obviously farms and so on are in competition with each other. About this incentivizing the cost process of putting in place the pillars, the recommendations on demonstrating trustworthiness, and linking that into this strategic long-term funding as part of an incentive to gain that funding, and also to move forward the best practice in the demonstrating trustworthiness element. Got
you. Understood. Yep. Okay. Yep. Good point. Yes. Thanks.
Right, can I just quickly follow on from that as well? I think in our experience, when dealing with the commercial sector, if if there's no legal requirement to share data, then often it's a case of showing, giving some immediate payback. So yeah, people will give you the data, but you've got to give something back in return, and it's got to be useful.
So sort of like an in-kind.
Yes. Yeah.
That sort of. Okay.
Yeah.
Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Richard. All right. If there are no more questions, then we can close the call on time. Amazing. Well done to us, team. And thank you all to you as well, obviously. Thank you very much for being here. I know it's sort of, committing 2 hours on a Thursday morning is not always easy, but we really appreciate that you are here, that you gave us your input. And as said, we have 4 other workshops coming up through March on sort of a number of the different themes. So if you can, would be great to have you there. Of course, it won't be the last time that we're sort of engaging. So this will just be March. We will have definitely more coming up after that. But for today, have a great rest of your Thursday, a good rest of the week. And thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate the input.